For being here. Oh, and we're starting recording. I think my director's on here, so thank you. So great. Hello, my name is Kelsey Hansen. I am the outreach coordinator with the Alaska Wildlife Alliance. And I just want to say thank you all for attending Wildlife Wednesday. Thank you all for being here. AWA is a wildlife nonprofit that does work here in the state of Alaska to make sure that wildlife is being scientifically and ethically managed. We hold these free Wildlife Wednesday presentations thanks to our members, and without them, we truly cannot do a lot of the work that we do, and we couldn't have these free events. So thank you. If you are joining us and you are a member, pat on the back. We appreciate you contributing and for being a part of tonight's presentation. And we are joined tonight by our guest speaker, master's student Sanaa Siddiqi. She's volunteering her time and her expertise tonight to be here, and we greatly appreciate that. And she's going to be discussing bumblebees in Alaska, which I know I have a lot to learn about, so pretty excited to have her on tonight. And first, I'll be giving a little bit more of an intro to AWA and what we do, and then I'm going to hand it off to her for a presentation, and we will conclude with a Q&A session at the end for about 10 or 15 minutes. Bear with me, this is usually a little slow to get started. Wonderful. So some virtual engagement guidelines. We encourage no Zoom bombing. If you could keep your mute and your video off, well, your mute on and your video off, that would be great. It's amazing what technology can pick up nowadays. So to just help with background noise, we appreciate you keeping that off. We also encourage you viewing this presentation in full screen mode so that you can get the full experience of what's going on with the slides. And if you have any questions throughout the presentation or any comments for our speaker, please use the chat. You can throw it in at the bottom of your screen, and then at the end of the presentation, we'll get to any questions or any conversations you want to jump in with. And then most importantly, we just ask that you enjoy and learn something new, share it with folks you know, and just have a good evening. It's going to be just an enjoyable time to learn something. And again, I just want to say thank you to our members. Without our members, these presentations would not be free for this evening. And we are doing work within the state of Alaska to protect Alaska's wildlife. We do advocacy and education and citizen science, and I'll touch on that in a moment, but doing the good work. So thank you for our members. This presentation is on behalf of our Southeast chapter. So we have 3 chapters throughout the state, one on the Kenai Peninsula, one in Anchorage, and one in the Southeast. And our Anchorage Wildlife Wednesdays are actually topics that are based statewide. But yeah, so we have 3, but this is for Southeast specifically. And again, we do citizen science, education, and advocacy. We currently have beluga monitoring. If you want to help with citizen science, that is one way to volunteer and help out. And that's weird. I got muted for a second. So we are doing beluga monitoring, and we specifically run the Kenai and Kasilof River sites down on the peninsula. And so if you want to help out there, you are more than welcome. And we also do education. That is our rockstar volunteer, Lori Craig, up at the top. And she is holding our bear aware signs that are on the Juneau public transportation systems for the electric buses. So if you've seen those, that is on behalf of us. And we also do tabling and some other events throughout the year. COVID has shifted us to some virtual, but we still try to meet in person if we can safely. We also do advocacy. We currently have a Map the Trap report and proposal going out. We are proposing to the Board of Game in January to get trap setbacks off of some popular trails in the Matsu Basin. So if that is something you are interested in, you can visit our website and also submit comments so the Board of Game can receive those. And we just submitted a lawsuit to protect polar bears up in the Arctic from drilling and harassment. So that is just a few snippets that is some work that we're doing. We have a news page on our website. These are just a few featured articles, but again, if you want to learn more about our polar bear lawsuit, you can check it out there, as well as volunteering for citizen science with the beluga whales. And we also have sometimes just some articles that get written up by some of our staff or our board members. One article that's listed on their website was from our vice president talking about spending time on the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge. Some events, we have Wildlife Wednesdays on Wednesdays, and we are not having those in December just to give everyone time for the holidays. And but we have our next one next Wednesday discussing Alaska's lynx, and that the following week after that we'll be talking about how can people and salmon coexist. That'll be for our Kenai Peninsula chapter. And some past events we've had, again, we have had Wildlife Wednesdays, and they are recorded and put up on our social media and our website and YouTube. And we also have new board members that we're seeking. So if you're interested in helping with our alliance, with the work that we're doing, if you have some expertise or some insights, and if you believe that you bring a diverse perspective and voice, we would love to have you apply to be a board member and become part of our team. You can join our pack. There's more information on that on our website that I can link you to in the chat. And we had wildlife walks this summer, bears, birds, and beers. We met up at a brewery after wildlife walking, and just had a good time connecting with the community. And we had a wildlife photography contest that just closed, but our winners were announced on our social media, and our calendars are getting developed as we speak, and those will be available in December. So if you're looking for a calendar for 2022, check us out. Again, thank you for our members. And if you're interested in supporting Alaska Wildlife Alliance, there are some opportunities below, but also we are just $35 a year to become a member. If you want to help us out, you can definitely do that on our website. Again, I can throw a specific link in the chat if you're interested. And thank you. I'm going to hand it off now to our guest speaker. And again, thank you so much, Sanaa, for being here and for volunteering your time.
Happy to do it. All right. Bear with me here just a moment. Okay, so as Kelsey said, my name is Sanaa Siddiqi. I'm a master's student with the UAA. I'm pursuing a master's in biology and science communication, and I'm here today to chat with you guys of bumblebees of the north and just how amazing and fantastic they are. So I hope you guys enjoy and learn something today. So quick introduction to bumblebees generally. Their insect order, just to throw a scientific term out there, is Hymenoptera. They're basically hairy wasps, which is to say, at one point evolutionarily, bumblebees and wasps, shared the same starting point, but they diverged, and they've been evolving for 100 million years since. And just to kind of put that in context, we have been evolving as humans for 2 million years. So they've got that on us. And then there's about 250 bumblebee species globally that we know of, with 46 species known in the US and 23 here in Alaska, which makes this state fantastically diverse for bumblebee populations. A couple of random facts: bumblebees have been known, or rather the queen specifically, to migrate across entire bodies of water, which is possibly how they made it here to Alaska. They are social insects, but there are other varieties that are parasitic, such as the cuckoo bumblebee. And the cuckoo bumblebee essentially disguises itself as other bumblebees and pushes queens out of their nests and takes over and then introduces her own brood. But we're only here today to talk about one species in particular, but we will go over some generalities about bumblebees as we go along here. A couple of myths. I'm sure that people have heard these at some point in time. One is bumblebees produce honey. They do not produce honey. They still, however, are invaluable members of the ecosystem. One you may have heard of quite a bit is that bumblebees defy the laws of physics because nothing that round and fat and fuzzy should be flying anywhere. They have no business doing that, when in fact, they rotate their wings in a figure-8 motion front to back and generate lift like tiny hurricanes. So every time you see them buzzing around, just think about how marvelous that is that they're able to generate lift that way. So I'm just going to quickly go through the bumblebee life cycle. They are different to honeybees in that bumblebees do not have a multi-year lifespan like some honeybee species do. So we'll kind of go through the circle here. You have your queen. She does live through the winter, but the rest of the hive does not. She comes out of a state of hibernation. That's number 1 in the image there, having mated in the fall. So she's ready to go. And then she goes and establishes a nest site. And that essentially means, you know, in the springtime, you might see a really big, fat, fuzzy bumblebee buzzing really close to the ground. And essentially what she's looking for is places like hollowed out logs or overhangs that are kind of tucked away, places that are close to the ground or even underground that are quite safe for her to establish her nest. And then she builds a wax pot to store nectar. And bees generally, they have wax glands that they secrete wax from, and they kind of groom themselves and they stroke the wax out, and they are able to build these wax pots. And then she has this job where she's running around, well, rather flying around and gathering nectar, storing it in the wax pot. And when she has an adequate source of nectar, she builds a sort of platform or sort of cake, and she kind of puts pollen balls on top and starts planting eggs. And when she has an adequate number, then, you know, they start to hatch, and she takes care of her brood and she's feeding them with the pollen and the nectar. And then after 4 weeks, they spin cocoons, and then 2 weeks later, the brood hatches. So the colony grows and gathers nectar, and at that point, the queen's task is to take care of the brood while the workers go out and they're gathering nectar and bringing it back to the hive. And then eventually at the end, in the fall, the queen mates with males, and then she starts seeking out an overwintering site. And at this point, the other females of the hive and the males, they start dying off, and the queen enters a state of torpor or hibernation, and then the cycle starts all over again. So I do see this bumblebee has a pin in it, but it was very much not alive at the time. This is usually a method which is used to study them, because it's really hard to sit and figure out a bumblebee's anatomy when they're moving around quite a bit. So we're going to take a quick peek at bumblebee anatomy here. I promise it will be relevant later on. The main things to look at here are the ocellus, which is basically a very basic eye, and it enables them to navigate the darkness of the hive. And then you have the actual eye, which is like a compound eye that you see in a lot of insects, and that helps them differentiate color and light and so on and so forth. But the most notable thing that we need to look at here is the tergum, and this section it's divided into multiple segments. And this part of the bumblebee is where you kind of look at the stripe patterns later on. And so we'll take a look at that here in a minute. Other things to kind of look for is, you know, wing length. If you think about a dragonfly, for example, its wing follows the length of its entire body. Bumblebees are a bit different in that they have a shorter set of wings. You've got the corbicula, and that's the pollen basket, which is also very important. And then I will also point out things like the foreleg, the midleg, the hind leg, and the cheek area, which I'll explain, you know, the importance of in a minute. So without further ado, how do we identify bumblebees? There's multiple ways of doing that. You can look at hair length, color patterns by the turgor, which we looked at in the previous slide. So there's a segment of the metasoma, which is that rear part of the bumblebee. But I'm just going to flip back here for a minute so you can look at the tugger again, or just look at the labels. The other thing that we look at is body size, but then you start getting into things like leg length and thickness. And this is why being a biologist is a full-time job. Our friend on the previous page and in the current page is Bombus polaris, the Arctic bumblebee, which is what we'll be focusing on today. And if you look in the lower left-hand corner, this is typically what bumblebee identification guides look like. And you can see that it's very differentiated. There's a great variety of color patterns there, and it tends to mirror quite a few different species. And this is why it's really challenging to identify them, but to identify new species as well. And you start getting to things like, you know, the leg length, the thickness, as well as the cheek length. And I don't know if you've tried this, but it's really hard to run around after a bumblebee with a measuring tape to try and figure out how long their cheeks are. And so this is why research and expertise in these areas is really important, because it's quite easy to miss something that might be a new species out there. So bumblebees are our friendly neighborhood pollinators. And I've got like a couple of slides here. If anyone wants to pitch in, who can identify what these plants are here in Alaska? You'll have to let me know what the chat box says here. Anyone?
I think
Absolutely.
Paul's got it with blueberries.
That's right. So these are bug blueberries right here in Alaska. Everyone's pretty familiar with those, I'm sure. How about these? Anyone? I know, a bit trickier. So, oh, there you go. So yes, this is willow, but this is specifically Salix arctica, the Arctic willow, and you'll recognize it by, you know, the fronds. Just keep an eye out for that as we, you know, move through the summer season into the fall. Last one. I bet you guys can identify these, anyone who's gone berry picking, especially in Hatchapas. Anyone? Okay, I'll spare you. These are lingonberries. So I guess you're wondering why I'm, oh, there you go. Now everything's showing up. There was a little bit of a delay there. So if you want to know what these all have in common, is all of these plants rely on pollinators to reproduce. And it's not only about the reproduction, but it's about having healthy plants. The pollen for these species and many other species is so heavy that they are heavily dependent on insect pollinators to cross-pollinate. Otherwise, what happens is they don't produce enough fruit, or they produce poor fruit. And so while a bumblebee, or rather a honeybee, can pollinate a single blueberry flower, in the same period of time, a bumblebee can pollinate as many as 6. So, and I'm going to circle back to, you know, different types of pollination later on, but I just want to emphasize that all these plants are dependent on bumblebees in order to thrive in the ecosystem. So we're going to have a quick peek at floral anatomy, and this is a very basic idea. Flowers reproduce by passing pollen grains from the anther, which is the male part of the flower, to the stigma, which is the female part of the flower. So as I said previously, some plants are able to self-pollinate, while others require cross-pollination, where grains are transferred from one flower to another. Self-pollination limits genetic diversity, while cross-pollination is far healthier for the plant and animal species alike to ensure that they thrive and that they survive. So wind versus insect pollination. This is fairly self-explanatory. If you've ever puffed on a dandelion before over the course of your life, you're essentially enacting wind pollination. When pollination is very generic, it's like your pine trees or your grass. There's not a lot of variety in the way that they look. It's very widespread, while insect pollination is heavily dependent on insects such as, even moths, flies, bees, and wasps. As much as we dislike them, they are also important pollinators, and bumblebees. So while wind pollination is widespread with low diversity, direct pollination or insect pollination, the diversity is substantially greater than wind. This is how we're able to, have our heirloom vegetables have very specific breeds of fruit and vegetables, different types of apple trees, is because of direct pollination or insect pollination. Big, hairy, and social. And now we get to my favorite part of the presentation. This is the Arctic bumblebee, Bombus polaris. Note the black thorax, and they tend to have orange or yellow edges, and they can have a black tip on the end. They're larger than many species of bumblebee, and their large bodies are able to retain heat for a greater period of time. And if you look at this particular specimen, there's some uneven hairs there, and they are super hairy, like they're particularly fuzzy. And that extra thick coat affords some better insulation as well in colder temperatures. Now, of all the bumblebee species that we have up here, there are only 2 that are specific to the Arctic environment. The rest at some point in time, and remember earlier I said, queens crossed over bodies of water or may have migrated from elsewhere. At some point in time, they migrated from outside of Alaska, outside the Arctic, and they settled up here. But this species is very special because it's one of our native species here in the Arctic Circle. So some quick facts about Arctic bumblebees. Like I said before, they grow faster and have more hairs than any other species of bee. Because we have these incredibly long, cold winters here, they spend 9 months of hibernation in torpor. They're visible about mid-May. They're early keystone pollinators of Arctic willows, and they are poikilothermic, which means that they don't generate their own body heat. So they have to find other sources to maintain their body temperatures. It's another way of saying cold-blooded, but we don't really use that term. So this is a fantastic dorsal view of the Arctic bumblebee. You can see those pollen baskets, and earlier on we looked at where they carry those. And basically, they go and find a flower and they kind of shake themselves up. And then the bumblebee grooms herself with her legs, and it's like she's got these kind of, these long spikes, and she uses them to rake herself and groom that pollen onto the basket so that they stick to the corbiculae. Not only that, but the collection of pollen is actually aided by static electricity, which bees generate in flight. Flowers, which I discovered and I thought was insane, they're actually negatively charged, while bumblebees generate a positive charge. So it aids in pulling the pollen onto their bodies. You'll sometimes see them like dusted all over with pollen, and that's kind of before they've groomed themselves. And it's because the pollen is actually attracted to them as well. It will spring onto the hair of a well-charged bee. And obviously this one does not have a pin stuck through it. This was a live capture so that it could be studied closely and then released. And take a look at how small those wings are against its body. The body is huge compared to the wings. Again, think about a dragonfly's wings that are long and elongated against their bodies. This bumblebee is so chunky that like the wings look really small in comparison. But by looking at the stripe patterns, and you remember the diagram from earlier, you can actually narrow down the number of species that you're looking at and maybe get a better idea of what kind of bumblebee that you've got in front of you. So here's another one. Can anyone tell me what these flowers are? I'm sure we have quite a few botanists and amateur botanists in the audience today. And I'll give it a minute because there seems to be like a little bit of a lag. So I'll see who can guess what these are. Thank you, Diane. Yes, this is an Alaska poppy. Specifically, this is Papaver alaskanum throughout central Alaska, the Aleutian chain, and throughout south central. They tend to bloom in June and July, and you'll see a lot of other poppy species as well. Some of them may be non-native, but they're now naturalized to being in Alaska, and they look similar. So our Arctic bumblebee loves these flowers. Just note their conical shape. And essentially, because of their shape and color, they reflect and concentrate sunlight. And that enables the bees to kind of settle into the cone of the flower and to elevate their body temperature so that, you might catch one napping in one of these, in one of these flowers. And that's one of the many ways that they're able to kind of regulate their temperature up here. So there's like a tiny lag. There we go. And so, like, how do bumblebees get the pollen off the flowers? They engage in something called buzz pollination or sonication, or someone might call them twerking, depending on what generation you're in. And by doing this, they can actually raise their internal body temperature up to 60 degrees above ambient air temperature, and that enables them again to regulate their temperature in very cold environments. So I'm going to show you an example of what that looks like. This is not the Arctic bumblebee in particular. Oops, let's see. And this is a great video because you can see it in slow motion. And essentially, they're kind of generating all that shaking using their wing muscles. You can see that there's pollen floating off the flower and just erupting in clouds around it. And by doing this, it's quite remarkable. They're basically shaking the pollen onto themselves. And you can see like that static charge in effect here, where it's just kind of coating all that fuzziness, and it's catching all the pollen. I'll let you guys view that for a minute, because this is really remarkable. And again, just remember how fast those wings are moving in that figure-8 motion, generating lift. So something else I'd like to touch on here, I mentioned the compound eyes earlier. Their eyes are slightly larger than honeybees, and I'll explain why this is really important. The question we want to ask is, well, how do bees know which flowers to visit? So they are able to see, you can see in that bottom image there, they can see, so while we see within what is known as, the rainbow spectrum, usual red through violet, bees actually also see in ultraviolet. So they're able to see something that we're not able to see. There are floral patterns that are only visible in the UV that indicate the location of the stamen. And they have an excellent memory for flower types and patterns. It also assists them in navigation. It's a bit like landing lights on a landing strip. And while we're still learning about honeybee eyesight, we know even less about bumblebee sight. And one additional thing that makes this quite remarkable is that when a bumblebee goes out to gather, pollen and nectar, they tend to only gather from the same type of flower before they return. So they'll only seek out one one nectar source from one floral species before they return to the hive. And that's why sometimes when you see them, you'll see them kind of hovering. They'll start at a dandelion and like move to the next one and the next one. And they're not moving on to any other floral species. So I'll explain why this is a really terrible slide. Why are this species so important? All species serve a role, whether they're cute or whether they're hideous or whatever it is they have about them. They're all terribly important for the balance and the well-being of our local ecosystem. But I will explain why this species is important. They are an early pollinator of willows, as I previously said, and multiple species are heavily dependent on willow for survival. And there's a lot of questions that we don't really have answers to. Do bumblebees distinguish nectar sources? We really don't know. It's really dependent on the type of nutrition that they need. They have no brand loyalty. And these are the type of questions that we ask to try and determine what kind of impact these species have on the local ecosystem. We can look at them as barometers of the health of a local ecosystem. And there's been so many changes in our environment that the less we know about a species, the less that we know what their baseline is, or what kind of impact they have, or what kind of impact it would have to lose that particular species. So I'm going to talk about, the greater impact, ecosystem connections and keeping balance. So there is a lot happening in the slide. And what I'm illustrating here is the way that different things may be connected. So if you look at the orange bubbles, we've got the Arctic bumblebee, and different questions that I have brought up over the course of developing my master's as far as bumblebees go. So how important are Bombus polaris for pollinating willows? We do know that they're a keystone pollinator of early flowering willows. We know that they use willows as nesting sites, but there's also a lot of limited research available because Alaska is so great and vast. It's really hard to track down a particular species of bumblebee. But we can see that arrow leads to willows. And in turn, you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, we talk about indigenous populations here in Alaska. What do they use willows for? Well, they use, they have medicinal uses, salicin, which we find in aspirin. They have natural, willows are a natural source of that particular medicine. It's also used for wicking food and fuel. And then that kind of leads us into, okay, moose diets largely consist of willow as well. And then you can link that back to indigenous populations and say, well, it's important for subsistence hunting. It's part of cultural hunting tradition. And the overarching question here is, how does climate change and disruptive climate change impact all of this? Like, these are all really important questions to be asking that we may not necessarily have the immediate answers for, because it's a very broad question. And just segueing from that, just a couple of moose and willow facts here. Approximately 91.3% of moose diets in the summer consist of willow. Willows are pollinator dependent, as we've discussed here today. And so when you have one species that's so dependent on one plant species for survival, what happens, when, how much of that influences the health of the tree if you see a decline in pollinators, especially a species such as the Arctic bumblebee. And this leads me into talking about climate change and temporal overlap. So temporal overlap is a time frame in which a plant may flower and when pollinators are active. And so I'm going to throw a science term at you here, phenology. It's a natural cyclical seasonal patterns as relates to climate, plant, and animal life. Minute changes in the environment can disrupt the interaction between a specific species of pollinator and the type of plants they typically pollinate. So what we are looking at in this image is scientists seeking out the Arctic bumblebee along the Dalton Highway in 2016. And you can see the pipeline stretching off into the distance there. They are trying to understand more about that time frame that Arctic bumblebees are pollinating, as well as other behaviors, so we can better observe changes due to environmental impacts such as climate change. So when you think about the permafrost melting, you think about elevated temperatures, we've kind of gone into this slightly warmer winter than what we're typically accustomed to. These types of things are affected by climate change. And again, these are questions that we may not have a baseline for. We don't really have a lot of data on what Arctic bumblebees have been doing for the last 40 years. It's very sparse. And it may serve as a barometer as far as, what is happening in the Arctic ecosystem up here. And so there's really a huge question, why is this important? Why should we care? The short answer is that these changes may disrupt interactions between pollinators and plants. So the image that we're looking at here is bog bean flowers in Greenland. So research conducted in Greenland demonstrated that the temporal overlap, which we discussed just a moment ago, when flowers bloomed and when pollinators was present, was decreasing. So when you've got your changes in snow melt or alterations in temperature, you start getting longer, warmer summers that are changing plant life in the interior. There's no doubt it's going to impact insects. And it was also shown that increased temperatures from 1996 to 2009 led to a shorter flowering season. And so that reduced the number of pollinating visitors. So when trying to figure out these temporal mismatches has been really difficult because we have, again, very limited baseline information for what is happening with these pollinated populations. Another point to consider is if one species dies out because of drastic changes, other pollinated species may step in, but we don't know what the long-term impact is of that. So as we see species in decline, it is really important to kind of stop and think, okay, well, what's this going to do, in a cascading way? How will this affect the planet in the long run? So again, I circle back to, how does this affect us? Like, what is the really big human impact? So what we're seeing here is teenagers attending Camp Sivu near Kobuk Valley National Park here in Alaska, and they're blueberry picking in the early fall. And so as we talked about the impact of, changing temperatures, of snow melt altering, and we're seeing this cascading disruption of like a loss of interacting pollinators and plants. What is happening in this community is typically they have a season where they harvest salmon and they have a season where they gather blueberries. But because of these drastic changes in the environment, these seasons are overlapping and it's proving difficult for them to be able to balance something that used to be separated and that they could plan their gathering season around. And especially in North America, we have seen, unfortunately, a decline in bumblebee species, but we don't have enough information about the range of factors that are affecting them. And when you think about it, even blueberries are part of a complex ecosystem. Everything is interconnected. We may only be scratching the surface now, but we do know that all of these things matter. Specific plants may not necessarily like grass or moss that can reproduce easily through wind pollination, for example, but the things that are insect pollinated, we don't know the full impact or what's going to happen to them in the future based on the information that we have now. We're just getting a glimpse into this and we can make guesses or projections, but that's based on limited data. So how can we help? There's lots of ways that you can help. They may seem small, but they do have a lasting impact. Provide flowers, ensure that they're authentically local to Alaska. Sometimes you might get like an Alaskan seed mix, but it might actually have non-native plants. Try not to use pesticides. When you're planting a garden, try and stick to natural methods as much as possible. Leave as much of your yard to be as natural as possible. And you can also identify and share locations that you find species. There's a fantastic app that you can download for your phone called iNaturalist. And essentially you can take a photo of what you're looking at and upload it to this fantastic database, which is very helpful for everyone, for scientists and amateur naturalists alike. And it will, it's building a map of, where these sightings are of these species. Also share what you know, share what you've learned today. When you go out, pick up a book or pick up a bumblebee identification guide and keep an eye out for, for species, and over time you'll find that you will develop a familiarity with different species out there. And I'm just going to leave you with this. This is not a species here in Alaska, nor a flower, but it did give me a good laugh. This is a bottle gentian. Just to underscore the determination of bumblebee species and the lengths that they go to, you can see she's trying her hardest to get in there, and the flower is, it kind of holds itself closed quite hard. And she's in. And if I were her, after all that effort, I'd probably take a nap in there. And that's it for me. If you have any questions, please feel free to throw them my way, and I will do my very best to answer them. I'm just going to
Thank you. Yeah, This is Kelsey again, Sanaa. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing all that. I'll throw some questions your way that we get into the chat. One that we had earlier throughout your presentation was, are bumblebees troubled by the pests, new and old, of domesticated bees?
That is a really good question. I'm just going to read that question again. So new and old of domesticated bees. That's a really good question. I actually want to research that and get back to whomever that was. So if they want to send their email your way, I will absolutely look that up and I will see if I can find an answer.
Wonderful. Yeah, if someone can throw their email into there, if you want to get your answer, throw it in. Let's see here. Is there any current concern for the Arctic bumblebee's health on the population level in Alaska?
So the short answer, we don't know enough to determine whether they are a threatened species or not. So little is known about them. And you know, there is a concerted effort to do research on them because they are so remote and because they cover such a wide range. We don't actually know what the conservation level is for sure. I believe that they're considered non-threatened. However, this is based on what limited information we have and limited sightings.
That makes sense. I can only assume it's hard to track bumblebees in the Arctic across all of Alaska. Great. How are queens born?
That is a really good question. I do know with honeybee species, in particular, they actually feed, they feed larvae royal jelly, and there's kind of this hormonal change that happens that develops a queen. As far as bumblebees are concerned, that's a really good question. And whoever that is, and again, I am happy to research this stuff and get back to you because I learn a lot more too. So whoever asked that question, send your email my way. I will look into that answer for you.
Great, thanks. You use the term hairy a number of times to describe bumblebees. How analogous are these hairs to mammalian hair?
I know who's asking that too. I do describe them as hairy, but Jeff, that was not a fair question. That's a PhD person asking me a question. I don't have a good answer for you. I'll have to look into that.
That actually is a fascinating question. Now I'm very curious.
Right, now I want to know what the difference is, how close they are to mammalian hairs.
PhD project. Do bumblebees share any known symbiotic relationships with other bees or insects?
Not to my knowledge. I know that there are parasitic species that like to invade bumblebee nests and that they are threatened by parasitic insects. But to my knowledge, there are no known symbiotic relationships with other bees or insects.
Are bumblebee species identified by genetics in addition to morphology?
That is a fantastic question. I don't have a ready answer for that. Again, I would like to research that and develop my own knowledge on that, but I will answer questions as best I can today.
Wonderful. Here we go. What percentage of early willow pollination can be contributed to the Arctic bumblebee?
I don't have an exact percentage. However, the Arctic bumblebee is one of our first emerging bumblebee species. So the queens are one of the first bumblebees you'll see buzzing around on the tundra. My understanding is that they are a keystone early pollinator of willows. So they are a significant contributor to early pollination in the springtime.
Very cool. Yeah, thank you. If you had a question, that's all the questions we have now. You can throw any other additional questions into the chat. Those that already asked questions, if you want to throw your email in and Sanaa can follow up, that would be great. One question was from Linda Shaw, and I just want to do a shout out. You are one of our Southeast chapter board members, and you also are going to be in our calendar with some featured photos. So good to have you on, Linda. A personal question, Sanaa. What is your favorite part of the bumblebee?
It's probably got to be that, I don't know, that their fuzziness. I like everything about them. As I've kind of pursued my master's and as I've been reading a lot of papers and just learning more and more about them, the thing about bumblebees being positively charged and the flowers being negatively charged was something that I learned in recent weeks and I had no idea about. So everything about it is fascinating. I've come to appreciate them so much, and what they do for the environment. But gosh, I think it has to be that fat fuzziness. And I will tell you that I probably spent way too much time looking at bumblebee bums on the internet because there's just so many photos of them getting stuck in flowers. And if I were them, I'd just be napping all day long. So
What a life to be a bee. Positively charged.
And I just saw Linda's question. So they actually do have a stinger like honeybees, and unfortunately, like honeybees, those barbed stingers will actually kill them. So when they do sting something, it's purely in self-defense. I've actually, if you see a dopey bee in the shade, you can actually pick them up and they're quite docile. So that's also a really fun way to you can actually handle them if you're very gentle and put them back where you found them.
Super cool. Why did you choose bumblebees to study?
Gosh, that's a really good question. I had a friend who got me into honeybees some years ago, and I think I just developed this sense of just observing, bumblebees, and I sat thinking, gosh, I don't really know very much about them. We all talk about honeybees, which are fantastically important, but none of our honeybees up here are native to Alaska. They're all from the lower 48 or from Europe, different breeds of honeybees. And yeah, I was just kind of watching them and I thought, oh my gosh, I don't know anything about them. And then the more I started reading and learning about them, the more fascinated I became. And then I learned about the Arctic bumblebee in particular and just thought it was a really cool species. And it's quite special because, it's one of the very few species that are native to the Arctic. And as far as we knew for a while, there were only 2 Arctic specific bumblebees that evolved in the Arctic Circle. And then we've actually started to discover other ones. And again, this is down to the stripe patterns and remoteness and these other factors where these bees kind of evolved separately to other species on their own. And so it's really interesting to me that there is so much that we don't know that we can learn, and we just don't know how many more species there are out there.
Yeah, awesome. With climate change and warming temperatures, the blueberry plant moves up in elevation. How will this affect Arctic bumblebees?
That is a fantastic question. So I would imagine what this will do is that they will move further north because they are, adapted for the colder temperatures. They'll probably move where the blueberry plants do. It has been known for them to be found at higher elevations. And I know that hiking some of the mountain trails up here, I've seen bumblebees pretty high up in elevation, just kind of buzzing around and doing that thing. So they will move, wherever the pollinating plants are and whatever the temperature that they're adapted to.
This is my own follow-up question. Can they overheat? Can they survive in a warmer area, or do they just prefer the colder temperatures? Could they make it?
That's one of those questions that we don't have really good answers to because not a lot is known about them. Again, that one group of scientists came up in 2016, but there have been very limited studies on them. They're quite a mysterious species, and we don't have a lot of good baseline information. We don't have long years of data where we can say, okay, well, this is what they typically like. And so this is, again, why this type of research is important, because the more we learn about them, the more we can determine, okay, do they actually prefer the colder temperatures, or will they be adaptable for the warmer ones? And I would say because they have evolved to be adapted to the colder temperatures, I can't imagine they would be happy if the environment warmed up, beyond what they're accustomed to.
Mhm. That makes sense. How long do queen bumblebees live?
So if I had to think off the top of my head, 2 years comes to mind, but don't quote me on that. That is a question I want to circle back to and verify that, that is the actual answer.
What distinguishes bumblebees from other bees, such as the solitary bees?
Gosh, that's a broad question. Well, bumblebees are social. So unlike a honeybee hive, which is very, you know how structured they are. They've got those amazing hexagonal shapes. Bumblebee hives are quite chaotic and higgledy-piggledy, and they're kind of these, this cluster, not nearly as neat or tidy. And you get solitary bees, which tend to have like single burrows. I know you've seen, carpenter bees and other species. But that's quite, it's quite a loaded question because there's so many bee species out there. Bumblebees are unique in that they are hairy. We'll kind of circle back to the, the hair thing earlier on, whether that's close to mammal hair or not. But, they're kind of, and I think also the fact that they are so rounded and well adapted to pollinating. But that's among, the few things that distinguishes them from other bee species.
Very cool. What predates on bumblebees in Alaska?
So over the course of my reading, I didn't see anything distinctly as far as what preys on them. There are a lot of parasitic species. You get your cuckoo bumblebee that goes in and invades the hives. I wasn't running into a lot of information about whether birds prey on them or not. But as wasps, territorial wasps will fend off bumblebees, but I don't know if they specifically target them. So that's about the extent of my understanding. I'm sure that there's a lot more information out there. I'm still learning a lot about this stuff, but it's one of those things, again, like I'm happy to do a bit more research on because that benefits me as well because I learn some more.
Yeah, absolutely. Throw direct messages to Sanaa if you have anything.
Please send me all the questions I wasn't able to answer today, and I'll be happy to do a bit more reading.
Yeah, that'd be great. Do these bumblebees show a preference for certain plant species, or maybe there isn't enough overlap in the relevant species phenology?
So they do favor certain flower species and plant species. They have no brand loyalty, and it's difficult to determine like why the hive, why they may pick one particular flower. Like I said earlier, they'll kind of pick one species if they're going to do a pollinating round, or if they're going to gather pollen. They'll kind of pick one species and bounce from one to the other of the same flower. But why they pick it, I would imagine it depends on the pollen's nutritional content and what the hive's needs may be. Certain species do seem to have favorites as far as flowers are concerned. However, that's just based on observations of bumblebees. So that
Someone's on.
Yeah, so I was going to say someone just unmuted, but like I said, they have no brand loyalty. There's observations that suggest, they seem to favor these particular flowers, based on people going out in the field and watching them. But it's it doesn't necessarily paint the whole picture of which flower species they have preferences for.
Interesting. Someone asked, what is the name of the parasitic species that invades the hive? Again, they missed the word.
So that would be the cuckoo bumblebee. A queen will actually go and find herself a very convenient hive, and through hormones, she'll generate a whole bunch of hormones, and she'll be straight up aggressive, and she'll either kill off the other queen or she'll drive her out of the hive, and then she'll plant her own eggs, and she'll kind of through hormonal control, she'll coax the entire hive to care for her brood. So that would be the cuckoo bumblebee.
Great, I hope that answers their question. I think that's all the questions that we got covered. If I missed anything, someone thrown out, but oh, we have another one. In terms of flowers, I think it might be a comment, but in terms of flowers, the bumblebees seem to like delphiniums and comfrey a lot.
Right, and I'll actually see silvicola, so Bomba silvicola, like I guess the sylvan bumblebee, favoring a lot of willow and dandelion. And they look very similar to like the red-tailed bumblebee, but they they seem to really like dandelions for whatever reason. I've seen them on willows. I'll have to keep an eye out to see them hovering on delphiniums and comfrey, but that was an interesting tidbit, so thank you for that.
Very cool. All right, I think if anyone has any like comments or questions, throw them in, but I think we are just concluding the evening, so you can send out all sorts of congrats if you will. I'll be quickly throwing out a link quick. If you are interested in becoming a member with AWA, I'll be throwing a link out there. Again, it's just as little as $35 a year, and because of our members, we had this free presentation. So thank you so much, Sanaa, for devoting your time and volunteering your knowledge and time for being here. I know you're a master's student and you don't get paid for the good work that you're doing. So it means a lot that you're here and that just in your free time, you're willing to share what you know. So thank you so much. And yeah, all sorts of flooding in with thank yous coming in the messages, but it meant a lot for you to be here.
Well, I wanted to thank you as well for the opportunity to allow me to share stuff about my favorite species, and also for everyone's patience as far as answering questions. There is a lot that I'm learning that I don't know, and you guys asking me these questions, gives me the opportunity as well to go out and get answers for my own knowledge as well, so that I'll have already answered next time, but just so I learn a little bit more about bumblebee generally.
Very cool. Thank you. That's it for the evening, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording real quick.